The moment his hand moved, he thought he was in control, but that was the exact second everything began to fall apart. The late afternoon sun hung low over Maplewood Avenue, casting long golden shadows across the quiet suburban street where everything felt ordinary, almost too ordinary, like the calm before something no one could predict. A soft breeze carried the scent of freshly cut grass, and the distant hum of passing cars blended into a peaceful rhythm that made the neighborhood feel safe, untouched by chaos. And right there, walking slowly along the sidewalk with measured steps, was Mrs. Evelyn Carter, 72 years old, her posture slightly bent, but her presence steady, dignified in a way that didn't demand attention but quietly earned respect. She wore a simple navy cardigan over a pressed blouse, her silver hair neatly pulled back, and in her hand, she carried a small paper bag from the local pharmacy just 2 blocks away. Nothing about her stood out to the untrained eye. Nothing about her screamed importance. And maybe that was exactly why he chose her. Officer Daniel Hayes leaned against his patrol car parked just off the curb, his arms crossed, scanning the street with the kind of detached authority that came from years of believing he knew exactly how the world worked. His badge caught the sunlight, flashing briefly like a signal of power, a symbol he had long stopped questioning. To him, people weren't individuals anymore. They were categories, patterns, assumptions waiting to be confirmed. And when his eyes landed on Evelyn, something in his mind clicked, not based on evidence, not based on reason, but on a quiet, dangerous instinct that had guided too many of his decisions before. He pushed himself off the car slowly, adjusting his belt as he stepped forward, his boots hitting the pavement with deliberate weight. The sound echoed just enough to turn a few heads nearby, though most people quickly looked away, choosing comfort over confrontation. Evelyn noticed him. Of course she did. You don't live 72 years in this country without recognizing that shift in the air, that subtle tightening of space when authority decides to focus on you. But she didn't panic. She didn't rush. She simply stopped, her fingers tightening slightly around the paper bag, her eyes lifting to meet his with a calm that wasn't ignorance, but experience. "Ma'am," he called out, his voice firm, carrying the expectation of obedience rather than the invitation of conversation. She nodded politely, her expression composed. "Yes, officer." Her voice was soft, steady, the kind of tone that had soothed children, settled arguments, and carried wisdom earned over decades most people would never fully understand. For a brief second, something almost human flickered across Hayes' face, a hesitation so small it could have been imagined. But it vanished just as quickly as it came, replaced by that same rigid certainty. "Where are you coming from?" he asked, his eyes narrowing slightly, as if the answer itself might reveal something hidden beneath her calm exterior. Evelyn lifted the small bag just slightly. "The pharmacy down the street," she replied. Simple, honest, unthreatening. And yet, somehow, it wasn't enough. Not for him. Not for the narrative already forming in his mind. The air between them grew heavier, quieter. Somewhere in the distance, a car door slammed. A dog barked once, and then fell silent. And in that silence, something invisible began to build, like pressure beneath the surface of still water. Imagine standing there, in her place, feeling eyes on you not because of what you've done, but because of what someone else has decided you represent. Imagine knowing that no matter how calmly you speak, how respectfully you stand, the outcome might already be written. Evelyn didn't need to imagine it. She had lived it. Hayes took another step closer, closing the distance in a way that shifted the balance completely. "I'm going to need you to stay right here," he said, his tone tightening, less conversational now, more directive. Around them, a few people had slowed their pace, curiosity pulling them in despite themselves. Phones began to appear, subtle at first, then more obvious as the tension became impossible to ignore. Evelyn remained still, her breathing steady, her gaze unwavering. And then, almost imperceptibly, she exhaled, a quiet release of something deeper than fear, deeper than frustration. It was recognition, not of him, but of the moment, of what this could become, of what it always became. And somewhere, far from that quiet street, something unseen was already beginning to move. The silence did not break all at once. It stretched, thin and fragile, like glass about to crack under pressure, and Officer Daniel Hayes felt it even if he could not explain it, That subtle shift in the air where something no longer felt routine, no longer felt simple, yet instead of stepping back he leaned into it. Because that was what he had always done. That was how he had learned to operate. By pushing forward until doubt disappeared or was forced to disappear, and in front of him Evelyn. Carter stood unmoved, her stillness almost unsettling in its quiet strength, as if she had already seen this moment play out before it even began. Hayes glanced briefly at the small crowd forming along the sidewalk, a few people slowing down, others pretending not to watch while clearly watching, phones now held a little higher, a little less discreet, and something about that made his jaw tighten, because attention meant scrutiny, and scrutiny meant risk. But instead of pulling away, he doubled down, his voice growing sharper, more commanding. As though volume alone could restore the balance he felt slipping. "I am asking you again, ma'am, what are you doing in this area?" he said, each word clipped, controlled, yet edged with impatience. Evelyn did not flinch, did not raise her voice, did not match his energy, and that contrast only made the moment heavier. "I told you, officer, I went to the pharmacy," she repeated gently, her tone unchanged, as if she were speaking to someone who simply needed clarity, not confrontation. For a brief second, the wind picked up, rustling the leaves of a nearby tree, and the sound seemed louder than it should have been, filling the space between them like a warning no one acknowledged. Hayes took another step closer, close enough now that the distance between authority and civilian felt almost non-existent, and his eyes searched her face not for truth but for something that would justify the direction he had already chosen. "Do you have identification on you?" he asked, his hand resting near his belt, not threatening, but not relaxed either. Evelyn nodded slowly, her movements deliberate, careful, as if she understood that even the smallest gesture could be misinterpreted. "Yes, I do," she said, her voice steady, and she began to reach into her handbag, not hurried, not hesitant, simply precise. And yet, something in that motion triggered him, not because it was wrong, but because it did not fit the script he had built in his mind. "Stop right there," he interrupted abruptly, his tone rising just enough to cut through the ambient noise of the street, and the movement around them seemed to pause in response, as if the entire scene had taken a breath it was not ready to release. Evelyn's hand froze for a moment inside her bag, then slowly came back out empty, her eyes meeting his again, calm, unshaken, but now carrying something deeper, something that looked less like patience and more like understanding. Imagine being told to stop in the middle of proving who you are, not because you did something wrong, but because someone decided your truth was not necessary. Imagine realizing that your identity is not being questioned, it is being dismissed. Hayes felt the eyes on him again, stronger now, heavier, and he could hear faint whispers from the crowd, not clear words, just fragments. Just enough to remind him that this was no longer just between him and her. This was being seen, recorded, remembered, and still, he pressed forward. "Turn around," he said, the command coming quicker this time, less measured, more reactive, as if he were trying to regain control of a moment that was slipping through his fingers 1 second at a time. Evelyn did not move immediately, not out of defiance, not out of fear, but out of something else entirely. Something that settled deep in her posture like a quiet decision. When she finally spoke, her voice was softer than before, but somehow carried more weight. "Officer," she said, "there is no need for this." The words were simple, but they landed differently, not as a plea, not as resistance, but as a statement, as if she were acknowledging not just the situation in front of her, but everything that surrounded it. Hayes exhaled sharply, a sound that betrayed more tension than authority, and for the first time, doubt flickered again, stronger now, sharper, but still not enough to stop him. Around them, the world had narrowed, the street, the houses, the passing cars all fading into the background as the moment stretched tighter, closer to something inevitable. And somewhere, unseen but very real, the first piece of a much larger chain reaction had already been set in motion, moving quietly, deliberately, toward a point none of them could yet see. Time did not rush forward. It thickened, pressing down on every second as if the world itself was waiting to see which direction this moment would take, and Evelyn Carter could feel it, not just in the quiet tension around her, but in the steady rhythm of her own heartbeat, calm but deliberate, like someone who had learned long ago that panic never solved anything. That composure was sometimes the only form of power left when everything else was taken away. Officer Daniel Hayes, however, felt something different, something far less stable, a subtle unease creeping beneath the surface of his confidence, not strong enough to stop him, but strong enough to make his movements slightly sharper, his tone slightly more rigid, as though he were trying to silence a voice inside his own mind that had begun asking questions he did not want to answer. "I said, turn around," he repeated, this time more firmly, the words landing heavier in the air, and a few more people along the sidewalk slowed their steps completely, no longer pretending to pass by, their attention fully captured by the scene unfolding in front of them. Evelyn did not immediately comply, not because she refused, but because she understood something deeper about what was happening, something that went beyond this single interaction, beyond this street, beyond this moment, and when she finally moved, it was slow, controlled, every motion intentional, as if she were not just responding to him, but acknowledging the weight of everything that had led here. As she turned, her eyes briefly drifted toward the reflection in the window of a nearby parked car, and for a fraction of a second, you could see it. Not fear, not anger, but memory, layers of it, years of it, experiences that had taught her exactly how moments like this could unfold. Imagine carrying a lifetime of understanding into a situation where someone else sees only seconds. Imagine knowing that the outcome might already be shaped by forces far beyond your control. Hayes reached for his radio briefly, then stopped, his fingers hovering as if unsure whether to escalate or maintain control on his own. And that hesitation, small as it was, did not go unnoticed by the crowd, nor by Evelyn, whose posture remained steady, her hands now visible, empty, resting calmly at her sides. "Why are you making this difficult?" he asked, the question slipping out before he could fully contain it, revealing more frustration than authority, and for the first time, the narrative he had constructed began to show cracks, subtle but undeniable. Evelyn turned her head slightly, just enough to meet his gaze again without fully facing him, and when she spoke, her voice carried something new, something that did not challenge him, but did not yield either. "I am not making anything difficult, officer," she said quietly. "I am standing exactly where you asked me to stand." The simplicity of her response landed heavier than any argument could have, and for a brief moment, Hayes found himself without an immediate reply, his mind searching for the next step, the next command, the next justification that would keep him moving forward without having to reconsider what he was doing. Around them, the energy shifted again, the murmurs growing slightly louder, more defined now, fragments of concern, of confusion, of quiet disapproval, and several phones were no longer hidden, held openly, recording everything, capturing not just actions, but tone, expression, hesitation. Hayes could feel it all pressing in. The awareness that this was no longer contained, that whatever happened next would not disappear into paperwork or routine, and yet, instead of stepping back, he leaned further into the role he had already committed to, because retreat, in that moment, felt more dangerous than continuing. "Place your hands where I can see them," he said, even though they already were, the redundancy of the command revealing more about his state of mind than his authority, and Evelyn complied without hesitation, lifting her hands slightly, her fingers relaxed, her movements precise, controlled, almost ceremonial in their calmness. And then, almost as if guided by instinct rather than decision, she spoke again, softer this time, but with a clarity that cut through everything else. "You still have time," she said. Hayes frowned slightly, the words not fitting into the structure of the situation as he understood it. "Time for what?" he asked, the question slipping out before he could stop it. Evelyn held his gaze, and for the first time, there was something unmistakable in her eyes. Not fear, not submission, but certainty, the kind that does not come from hope, but from knowledge. "To make a different choice," she answered. The street felt quieter than before, the air heavier, as if even the environment itself understood that something irreversible was approaching, and somewhere beyond that quiet suburban block, engines were already starting, signals already moving, a response already forming that would not be stopped. Not now, not after this point. The words lingered longer than they should have, hanging in the air between them like something fragile yet impossible to ignore. And for a brief moment, Officer Daniel Hayes did not move, did not speak, did not immediately push forward the way he had been doing since the encounter began, because something about what Evelyn Carter had just said did not fit into the pattern he relied on. It did not match the reactions he expected, and that unfamiliarity created a pause, small but significant. The kind of pause where decisions are still reversible. But pauses do not last forever, especially not in situations built on momentum, and Hayes quickly filled the silence with action, because action was easier than reflection, easier than questioning whether the path he was on had already gone too far. "You need to follow instructions," he said, his voice tightening again, regaining that rigid structure he trusted, even if it now carried a faint edge of urgency that had not been there before. Evelyn lowered her hand slowly, not in resistance, not in compliance alone, but in a way that suggested she was no longer responding to him as much as she was observing him, measuring something deeper than the words he was saying. Around them, the crowd had grown thicker, no longer just passers-by, but witnesses, people drawn in by the gravity of the moment, their presence forming a quiet perimeter that neither Hayes nor Evelyn could ignore. Some stood with arms crossed, others held their phones steady, recording every second, and though no one spoke loudly, the collective awareness in the air had shifted from curiosity to tension, from observation to silent judgment. Hayes could feel it now, the weight of eyes, the subtle shift in control, and it pressed against him in a way that made his next move feel more important than any before it, because this was no longer just about a question on a quiet street. It was about maintaining authority in front of an audience that was no longer passive. "I am going to ask you one more time," he said, each word deliberate, each syllable chosen to re-establish dominance over a situation that was quietly slipping beyond his grasp. "Do you understand what I am telling you?" Evelyn met his gaze fully now, her eyes steady, unwavering, and for the first time, there was something unmistakable in her expression, not confrontation, not defiance, but a calm certainty that did not depend on the outcome of this moment. "I understand exactly what you are saying," she replied, her voice even, measured, carrying no trace of panic or urgency. And that calmness did something unexpected. It did not de-escalate the situation, it amplified it, because it removed the emotional response Hayes subconsciously relied on to validate his position. Imagine speaking with authority and receiving composure in return, not submission, not fear, but clarity, and realizing that your control might not be as absolute as you believed. The sound of a car passing slowly behind them broke the silence for a split second, its engine low and steady, before fading again into the background. And in that brief interruption, something shifted inside Hayes, something less visible but more dangerous than anger. It was the feeling of losing narrative control, of no longer being certain how the next moment would unfold. He adjusted his stance slightly, his shoulders squaring as if posture alone could anchor him back into certainty. But his movements lacked the smooth confidence they had at the beginning, replaced instead by something sharper, more reactive. "Then you should know better than to question an officer in the middle of an investigation," he said, though the word investigation now sounded thinner, less grounded, as if even he could hear the gap between the claim and the reality. Evelyn did not respond immediately, and that silence was louder than anything she could have said. It stretched between them, filling the space with a tension that neither of them could step out of without changing the course of everything that followed. Finally, she spoke, her voice softer than before, but carrying a weight that settled deeper than volume ever could. "Sometimes," she said, "it is not about knowing better." Hayes frowned slightly, the statement not aligning with the structure he expected, his mind searching for where to place it, how to interpret it, how to respond. "Sometimes it is about knowing what happens when people choose not to," she continued, her words steady, deliberate, and for the first time, there was a subtle shift in the way the crowd reacted, not outwardly, not dramatically, but internally, a quiet recognition that this moment was no longer ordinary, that something larger was unfolding beneath the surface of what they could see. Hayes opened his mouth to respond, to reassert, to redirect, but the words did not come immediately. And that hesitation, brief as it was, marked a turning point, because in that fraction of a second, The balance of certainty had shifted, not completely, not visibly, but enough that the next choice he made would no longer be just another step forward. It would be the moment that defined everything that came after. The hesitation did not go unnoticed, not by the crowd, not by Evelyn, and certainly not by Daniel Hayes himself, because in that fraction of a second where his words failed to come, something inside him shifted from control to reaction, from certainty to a quiet but growing pressure that he could not fully explain, and instead of stepping back into that moment of choice she had offered him, he stepped past it. "Enough," he said sharply, his voice cutting through the air with renewed force, louder than necessary, firmer than before, as if he could reclaim the narrative simply by refusing to acknowledge that it had begun to slip away. The word echoed just slightly against the surrounding houses, and for a moment, even the wind seemed to pause, as though the environment itself was bracing for what would come next. Evelyn did not move, her posture unchanged, her presence steady, but something in her eyes shifted, not in fear, not in resistance, but in recognition, as if she had just witnessed the exact moment a different path was no longer possible. Around them, the crowd tightened, the distance closing by inches as more people gathered, drawn by the tension that now felt undeniable, and the phones, once subtle, were now openly raised, their lenses fixed, capturing not just actions but the tone, the pacing, the choices being made in real time. Hayes could feel it pressing in on him, the awareness that this was no longer contained, that every movement carried weight, that every word would exist beyond this street, beyond this moment. And yet instead of softening, instead of recalibrating, he leaned further into the authority he believed would shield him. "Turn around and keep your hands visible," he repeated, his voice no longer asking, no longer explaining, simply asserting, and though the command itself had already been given, the repetition made it clear that this was no longer about procedure, it was about control. Evelyn slowly turned her body, her movements deliberate, almost measured in a way that felt less like compliance and more like acknowledgement, as if she were allowing the moment to unfold exactly as it was meant to, without resistance, without interruption. Her hands remained visible, steady, her breathing even, and for a brief second, the contrast between them became almost impossible to ignore, one driven by urgency, the other grounded in stillness. Imagine standing in a moment where everything around you is escalating, voices tightening, eyes watching, tension building, and choosing not to match it, choosing instead to remain anchored in something deeper, something unshaken by the noise. Hayes stepped closer again, close enough now that the space between them had completely collapsed, and though his movements were controlled, there was an edge to them now, a subtle sharpness that revealed the internal pressure he was trying to contain. "You should have listened," he said, quieter this time, but heavier, as if the words were meant less for her and more for himself, a justification spoken out loud. Evelyn did not respond immediately, and that silence, once again, filled the space with something heavier than any argument could have, something that made even the onlookers shift slightly, their expressions changing from curiosity to concern, from passive observation to a quiet realization that this was no longer routine. And then, in a moment that felt both sudden and inevitable, Hayes made a choice, not out of clarity, not out of necessity, but out of momentum, out of the need to assert control over a situation that had begun to challenge him in ways he did not understand. The movement was quick, decisive, and for a brief second, the entire street seemed to freeze, the kind of stillness that follows a moment everyone knows cannot be undone. A collective inhale moved through the crowd, subtle but unified, as if every person present had felt the shift at the exact same time. Evelyn's head turned slightly with the motion, her body remaining upright, her posture still composed, and when she looked back at him, there was no shock in her expression, no visible anger, just a quiet, undeniable certainty that settled deeper than any reaction could have. The silence that followed was heavier than anything before it, not empty, but full of awareness, of consequence, of something irreversible now set into motion. Somewhere in the distance, a car slowed, then stopped, the faint sound of an engine idling blending into the charged stillness of the street, and one by one, more people raised their phones, The moment now undeniable, no longer a question of what might happen, but of what had already begun. Hayes stood there, his breath slightly heavier than before, his posture still firm but no longer unshaken. And for the first time since this began, the certainty in his eyes flickered, replaced by something smaller, quieter, but far more dangerous, doubt. And Evelyn, standing exactly where she had been from the start, did not raise her voice, did not step back, did not react the way he expected, because she already understood something he was only just beginning to feel, that this moment, this single decision, had already reached beyond him, beyond her, beyond this street, and whatever came next was no longer his to control. The silence did not shatter, it deepened, settling over the street like a weight that no one could ignore, and in that stillness, something fundamental shifted, not just in the eyes of the crowd, not just in the quiet posture of Evelyn Carter, but within Daniel Hayes himself, though he would not admit it, not yet, not in a way that could stop what had already begun. The air felt heavier now, charged with something beyond tension, something closer to consequence, and the people watching could feel it too, their expressions no longer curious, no longer passive, but fixed, attentive, as if they understood that they were witnessing a moment that would not simply disappear when it was over. Hayes stood there, his shoulders squared, his stance firm, but the certainty that once defined his presence had begun to fracture, small cracks forming beneath the surface, invisible to anyone who was not looking closely, but undeniable to him. He shifted his weight slightly, his eyes flickering toward the growing line of phones aimed in his direction, and for the first time, the realization settled in that this was no longer just an interaction. It was a record, a narrative being captured from angles he could not control. And yet, instead of stepping back, instead of recalibrating, he did what he had always done when faced with uncertainty. He pressed forward, because retreat felt like weakness, and weakness was something he had spent years training himself to reject. "You are not cooperating," he said, his voice tighter now, less fluid, each word carrying the strain of someone trying to reassert control over something that was quietly slipping away. Evelyn did not respond immediately, and when she did, her voice was softer than before, but it carried further, reaching not just him, but everyone listening. "I have done everything you asked," she said calmly, her words simple, undeniable, leaving no space for misinterpretation. The clarity of her response only seemed to amplify the tension, because it exposed the gap between his claim and the reality unfolding in front of everyone. Imagine standing in a moment where the truth is visible, undeniable, and yet the direction of the situation continues to move away from it. Imagine knowing that what happens next is no longer about facts, but about choices. Hayes opened his mouth to respond, but the words did not come as quickly as before, and in that hesitation, something inside him shifted again, not outwardly, not dramatically, but enough that his next breath felt heavier, his next movement slightly less certain. He reached for his radio again, this time pressing it, his voice low but controlled as he called something in, though the exact words were lost beneath the ambient noise of the street. The action was subtle, but it marked a turning point, because it meant that this moment was expanding, reaching beyond him, beyond her, beyond what either of them could contain alone. Evelyn watched him, her gaze steady, her expression unchanged, but there was something deeper there now, something that suggested she had expected this, not in detail, but in direction, as if she had already understood where this path would lead the moment it began. Around them, the crowd shifted again, a ripple of movement passing through as people adjusted their positions, some stepping closer, others raising their phones higher, the quiet murmur of voices growing slightly louder, more defined. Fragments of concern, of disbelief, of quiet outrage beginning to surface. And then, somewhere in the distance, it happened, not loudly, not dramatically, but unmistakably, the low hum of engines approaching, steady, deliberate, different from the casual traffic that had passed earlier, and though no one could see it yet, the sound carried a weight that did not belong to coincidence. Hayes heard it too, his head turning slightly, his eyes narrowing as he tried to place it, to understand whether it was relevant or not, whether it mattered or not. And in that moment, the doubt that had been quietly building began to take shape, no longer just a feeling, but a question. Evelyn, however, did not look toward the sound, did not shift her posture, did not react at all, because she already knew, not the details, not the exact timing, but the inevitability of what was coming. "It is not too late," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper, but clear enough to reach him, to settle into the space between them one final time. Hayes looked at her, really looked at her now, as if trying to understand something he had missed, something he had overlooked, and for a brief second, the world around them seemed to narrow again. The crowd, the street, the noise fading into the background, leaving just the two of them standing in the center of a moment that had already moved beyond either of their control. And then the sound grew louder, closer, no longer distant, no longer ignorable, and whatever remained of the illusion that this was just another routine stop began to unravel completely. The sound was no longer distant now. It was present, rolling into the quiet suburban street with a deliberate weight that did not belong to chance, and one by one, heads turned, not just out of curiosity, but with a growing sense that whatever was approaching carried meaning, carried consequence, carried something that would shift everything that had just happened. The low hum of engines grew louder, steady and controlled, and then they appeared, two dark vehicles turning the corner in perfect sequence, their movement precise, their presence unmistakable even before they came to a stop. Along the curb just a few yards away, the crowd instinctively parted, not out of fear, but out of recognition that this was no longer an ordinary moment, that something official, something larger than a single officer's authority, had just entered the scene. Daniel Hayes felt it immediately, the shift in energy, the way the air seemed to tighten, the way the attention that had been focused on him now began to spread, to divide, to question, and for the first time since this encounter began, he did not move forward, he did not speak, he simply stood there, his posture still firm but no longer anchored in certainty. The doors of the vehicles opened in near unison, and from them stepped individuals whose presence did not need to be announced. It was understood, felt, recognized in the way they carried themselves, in the quiet confidence of their movements, in the absence of unnecessary words. Dark suits, measured steps, eyes scanning not with suspicion but with purpose. And then, from the second vehicle, he emerged. Marcus Carter. His presence did not demand attention, it commanded it, not through volume, not through force, but through something far more powerful, authority that did not need to prove itself. He moved with calm precision, his gaze already fixed on the scene before him, taking in every detail in a matter of seconds, the crowd, the phones, the officer, and finally, his mother. Evelyn Carter did not turn immediately. She did not react the way most would expect, because she had already known this moment was coming, not in its exact form, but in its inevitability, and when she finally shifted her gaze toward him, it was not with surprise, but with a quiet acknowledgement, as if two timelines had just aligned exactly where they were meant to. Hayes felt the shift fully now, not just in the environment, but within himself, the certainty that had guided him dissolving into something far less stable, something that made his next breath feel heavier, his next thought less clear. "What is going on here?" one of the suited agents asked, his voice calm but firm, directed not at the crowd, not at Evelyn, but at Hayes. The question was simple, but it carried weight, the kind that demanded more than a routine answer. Hayes straightened slightly, instinctively reverting to the posture he knew, the tone he had used countless times before, but something in his voice did not land the same way now. "I am conducting an investigation," he said, the words sounding thinner than before, less certain, as if even he could hear the difference. Marcus stepped forward then, closing the distance with controlled ease, his eyes never leaving Hayes, and when he spoke, his voice was quiet, measured, but carried a clarity that cut through everything else. "On what grounds?" he asked. The question was not aggressive, not raised, but it did not need to be. It landed exactly where it needed to, exposing the space between action and justification. Hayes opened his mouth, his mind searching for the structure he had relied on earlier, the reasoning that had felt solid at the beginning. But now, under the weight of this new presence, that structure began to crumble, piece by piece. The crowd watched in silence, the phones capturing everything, the shift now undeniable, the balance of power no longer where it had been just minutes ago. And then, without raising his voice, without changing his expression, Marcus took one final step forward and said something that seemed simple, but carried the weight of everything that had led to this moment. "That is my mother." The words did not echo, they did not need to, because their impact was immediate, absolute, and irreversible. The street fell into a silence deeper than before, not empty, but full of realization, of consequence, of a truth that had just redefined everything in an instant. And in that silence, Daniel Hayes felt it completely, the shift he could not undo, the moment he could not step back from, the realization that the authority he had relied on was no longer enough to shield him from what came next. The silence did not fade after those words. It settled deeper, heavier, like something final had just been spoken into existence. And for a moment no one moved. Not the crowd, not the agents, not even Daniel Hayes, who stood there as if the ground beneath him had shifted in a way he could not correct. The statement was simple, just 4 words, but it carried a weight that stripped away everything he had built his actions on, every assumption, every justification, every unspoken belief that had guided him up to this point. He looked at Evelyn Carter again, really looked this time, not through the lens of suspicion or authority, but with a clarity that arrived too late. And what he saw was not what he had decided she was, but what she had been all along, composed, steady, unshaken by everything that had just unfolded. Around them, the atmosphere changed completely, not gradually, but all at once, like a switch had been flipped, and the quiet murmur of the crowd shifted into something sharper, more defined, no longer uncertain but certain, no longer questioning but recognizing. The phones remained raised, but now they were capturing something different, not just an encounter, but a reversal, a moment where the balance of power had visibly and undeniably shifted. One of the agents stepped forward, his posture calm but authoritative, his gaze fixed on Hayes with a level of scrutiny that did not need to be verbalized. "Officer," he said evenly, "we are going to need you to step back." The instruction was clear, direct, and unlike the commands Hayes had been giving moments before, it carried no trace of escalation, only control, the kind that did not need to be asserted loudly because it was already understood. Hayes hesitated, just for a second, the instinct to respond, to explain, to regain footing rising within him, but the words did not come the way they had before, and that absence spoke louder than anything he could have said. Imagine standing in a moment where everything you relied on to define your authority no longer applies, where the structure you believe protected you begins to dissolve in real time, leaving you exposed not by force, but by truth. Marcus Carter remained still for a moment longer, his eyes never leaving Hayes, and when he finally spoke again, his voice carried something different now, not just authority, but precision, the kind that comes from knowing exactly where this moment fits within a much larger system. "Everything that has happened here is being recorded," he said calmly, his tone not threatening, not raised, but final, "and it will be reviewed accordingly." The words landed with quiet impact, not because of how they were delivered, but because of what they implied, not just immediate consequence, but lasting accountability. Hayes felt it fully now, the realization settling in piece by piece, that this was no longer a situation he could navigate through instinct or habit, that whatever came next would not be shaped by his interpretation, but by what had already been captured, witnessed, documented. The crowd shifted again, the tension no longer centered on uncertainty, but on anticipation, as if everyone present understood that the moment they had just seen was only the beginning of something much larger. Evelyn, who had remained composed throughout, finally moved, not quickly, not dramatically, but with the same quiet control she had held from the start, turning slightly to face Marcus more directly. Their eyes met, and in that brief exchange, there was no need for words, only understanding, a shared recognition of what had just occurred and what would follow. Hayes took a step back then, not out of command alone, but because there was no other direction left to take, and in that single movement, the shift became complete, visible to everyone, undeniable in its finality. The authority he had relied on minutes ago now felt distant, replaced by something far more uncertain, something that could not be reversed or explained away. And as the agents moved into position, as the crowd continued to watch in silence, as the moment settled into something permanent, one truth stood clear above everything else. not spoken aloud, but understood by everyone present, that the line between power and accountability had just been crossed, and there was no going back. The moment did not end with a loud conclusion. It did not dissolve into chaos or raised voices. Instead, it settled into something quieter, something far more lasting, like a line had been drawn not on the pavement of Maplewood Avenue, but in the memory of everyone who had witnessed it. And in that stillness, the reality of what had just unfolded began to take shape in a way that could not be undone. Daniel Hayes stood a few steps back now, no longer at the center of the moment, no longer directing it, but existing within it, and the shift was unmistakable, not just in where he stood, but in how he carried himself. The rigid certainty that once defined his posture replaced by something heavier, something that did not have a clear direction forward. He glanced once more at the crowd, at the phones still raised, at the faces that no longer avoided his gaze, and for the first time, he understood that this moment would not stay here, that it would travel, that it would be seen, discussed, remembered in ways he could not control. Imagine realizing that the power you believe protected you was never absolute, that it depended not just on position, but on choices, and that in a single moment, those choices could redefine everything. Evelyn Carter remained where she had been, her posture steady, her expression composed, not triumphant, not vindictive, but grounded in something far deeper, dignity that had never left her, even when it had not been recognized. She adjusted the sleeve of her cardigan slightly, a small, almost ordinary gesture that stood in quiet contrast to the weight of everything around her. And when she finally spoke, her voice was calm, measured, carrying not just to Marcus, but to the space itself. "Let this be enough," she said softly, her words not directed at any one person, but at the moment as a whole, as if she were acknowledging both what had happened and what did not need to happen next. Marcus Carter looked at her, his expression steady, understanding passing between them without the need for explanation, because he knew what she meant, not just restraint, but purpose, not just consequence, but meaning. He turned his attention briefly back to Hayes, his gaze firm but not harsh, and in that look there was no need for further words, because everything that needed to be understood had already been made clear. Around them, the crowd began to shift, not dispersing immediately, but easing, the tension that had held them in place slowly releasing, replaced by a quiet sense of closure that did not come from resolution alone, but from witnessing something real, something that challenged expectations and redefined them in the same breath. The agents moved with calm efficiency, their presence steady, their actions measured, ensuring that the situation continued forward not with escalation, but with control, the kind that restores balance rather than disrupts it. Hayes remained still for a moment longer, his eyes lowering briefly, not in defeat, but in recognition, the kind that comes when the weight of a decision finally settles fully into place. And though no words left his mouth, the silence itself carried meaning, an understanding that what had happened could not be explained away, could not be reframed, only acknowledged. And Evelyn, who had stood through it all without raising her voice, without losing her composure, took a single step forward, her movement quiet but certain, reclaiming the space not through force, but through presence, the same presence that had never wavered from the beginning. As the evening